Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the land down under from Australia, when a beautiful young woman was found brutally killed in a paddock in 1986. It sparked a huge public uproar and outrage as details of her horrific death came to light. This poor woman hadn't just been murdered, she'd been violated and tortured by her attackers. Quickly the police realised that there was more than one perpetrator here. She was killed by a gang of evil men, and the public were filled with so much anger because of what this woman was subjected to that they wanted to see these monsters executed for what they had done. This video is about a case that really shook Australia and the world to its core. You may have come across a recent debate online, particularly on TikTok, of man versus bear, where the majority of women have stated that they would rather be confronted by a bear if they were alone in the woods than by a man. And I think that this case is just one of many examples of why most of us do that, why we choose the bear. Let's delve into the tragic story of Anita Cobby. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault, torture, animal cruelty, bestiality and miscarriage. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 38 years now to February of 1986 in the city of Blacktown, located in New South Wales in Australia. And this is Anita Cobby. She was a 26-year-old woman who lived in Blacktown with her family. Born on the 2nd of November 1959 as Anita Lynch, Anita came from a family of 4. Her parents were called Gary and Grace Lynch, and Anita was one of 2 children. She had a little sister named Catherine who was about 5 years or so younger than her, and as far as I'm aware, Anita had a very normal, happy childhood. Her parents were very hardworking and loving towards their daughters. Her little sister Catherine said that she and Anita were always very close growing up. They had a really special bond, and Catherine described how Anita was always a role model to her. She really looked up to her big sister and idolised her, and Anita was always very protective of Catherine. Catherine recalled happy times with Anita where they would go out on shopping trips together. She described Anita as being a very stylish girl. She loved all things fashion and beauty, and I mean, she was an incredibly beautiful young woman. That was something that everyone said about her, really. She was just absolutely stunning. In particular, a lot of people would comment on her gorgeous hair. She had this big brown beautiful curly hair, and in fact as a teenager Anita even took part in beauty pageants, and in November of 1979, so when she was around 20 years old, she won the Miss Western Suburbs pageant, and I think everyone thought that she would go on to become a model. And what makes it even better is that Anita had the personality to match. She was described as being beautiful both on the outside but more importantly on the inside too. In fact, her parents Grace and Gary Lynch said of their eldest daughter, quote, "She was beautiful in mind, body and spirit." But rather than pursuing a career in modelling, Anita decided to follow in her mother Grace's footsteps career-wise. You see, her mother worked as a nurse, and Anita ultimately decided that she wanted to do that too. She wanted to work in nursing, which actually I think was quite surprising to her family at first. Her sister Catherine said that Anita was actually quite a squeamish person, to be honest. She didn't really like the sight of blood or gory things, so the fact that she chose to pursue nursing did seem a bit odd initially. However, Catherine said that on the flip side of that, Anita was just naturally a very caring person, very nurturing, which of course is the exact kind of qualities that you would want in a nurse. She wanted to help and look after people, so really she was perfect for the role. And her colleagues at the hospital that she worked in recalled how for Anita, her patients were not just patients. They were more than that. She would actually take the time to get to know the people that she treated. She would ask them about their lives and their families and their job, which I just thought was so lovely. I think that that in itself just shows you how much of a nice person Anita clearly was. Anita began studying for her nursing degree at the Sydney Hospital in Australia, and it was while she was working at the Sydney Hospital that she met and became very close with a man named John Cobby, who was also studying to become a nurse. John was a couple of years older than Anita, so he had been working at the Sydney hospital for quite a while by the time she started working there. And John said that as soon as he laid eyes on Anita for the very first time, he was gobsmacked. He was really taken aback because he thought that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever come across. He fancied Anita right from the moment that he met her, and he really wanted to ask Anita out on a date, but he thought that he had no chance with her really. He thought that she was so out of his league, bless him. But eventually they got chatting at work and Anita agreed to go out with John. They went out for a meal and a drink and the rest was history. They were basically inseparable from that moment on. They were so smitten with each other. They started dating, they fell in love, they moved in together, and in 1981 John asked Anita to marry him and Anita said yes. And the following year in 1982 they married and became husband and wife. Anita Lynch became Anita Cobby. And John and Anita fell pregnant too. They were expecting their first baby, which by all accounts they were over the moon about. But tragically, as it would turn out, Anita would very sadly lose the baby. She suffered a miscarriage and the couple had to deal with that heartbreak. It was following this tragedy when John and Anita decided to, I think, just go away for a bit, clear their heads and do a bit of travelling. One of the places that they travelled to was Rome, which was a particular favourite for Anita. She loved Rome. She thought that it was such a romantic place. So they were having a really great time on their travels, but it was when they returned to their lives in Australia when it became clear that the relationship between John and Anita was, I guess, under a bit of strain. As I understand it, this kind of stemmed from a difference of opinion, a difference of where they were both at in their lives. So when they returned to Australia, John was in a place where he felt ready to settle down and start a family with Anita. He wanted them to try for another baby after losing their first one. However, Anita didn't feel ready for that, and in fact she didn't want to settle down yet. I don't think she really knew what she wanted at this point in time. She thought that maybe she wanted to do a bit more travelling, and so while she took some time to, I suppose, figure all of that out, she and John decided to actually separate. Now this wasn't a forever separation. They weren't getting a divorce. I think they both knew that eventually they would come back together again, but for the time being they just decided that they needed a bit of a break from the relationship, and so Anita moved back to Blacktown in Sydney. Prior to this, the couple had been living in a city called Coffs Harbour in New South Wales, but when they separated, Anita moved back in with her parents Grace and Gary Lynch in Blacktown. John Cobby said that he and Anita were separated for only about 6 weeks, so really not very long at all in the grand scheme of things. And in January of 1986 they kind of came back together. They went on a little holiday on the Central Coast, and John said that he and Anita had the most amazing time together on this holiday. It was almost like they were on a honeymoon. It was that amazing. And it was then when they decided that they were ready to come back to each other again. They were ready to reconcile, and they even made plans to start looking for houses that they could live in. John and Anita Cobby were happy again, and they were making plans for their future, looking forward to their future together. But unfortunately, it was a future that they would not get to see, because in February of 1986, tragedy struck as Anita Cobby just suddenly, mysteriously disappeared. The date was the 2nd of February 1986. It was a Sunday, and a day that initially seemed to be like any other for Anita. She'd been to work that day. She started her shift at the Sydney hospital at 7 AM. She was working on the surgical ward, and then she finished her shift at around 3:30 that afternoon, and when work ended, she and a couple of her colleagues decided to go out together and grab a bite to eat. So they got changed out of their nurse uniforms, they left the hospital, and they made their way to this Lebanese restaurant in Redfern, I believe, which is a suburb of Sydney. So they were in the restaurant having a catch up, having a really good time, and then after a couple of hours they left, and Anita was dropped to the Central Railway Station in Sydney by her colleague, where she planned to get a train back to Blacktown, where she obviously lived with her parents. This was around 9 PM that evening. Shortly after 9 PM, Anita got on her train, which obviously took her back to the Blacktown train station. And once she was at the train station, she actually tried to call her father Gary from a payphone to ask if he could pick her up. However, for some reason, the phones weren't working that night and the call didn't go through. So now Anita was in a bit of a predicament. How was she going to get home from the train station? She could have gotten a taxi, however sources state that there were also no taxis available at the taxi rank that evening, and so she ultimately decided that she was just going to walk. Her parents' house wasn't too far away from the train station. It was just over a mile away, so it probably would have taken her about half an hour or so to get back. And despite the fact that it was night time, it was shortly before 10 p.m. by this point, so it was obviously pretty dark outside, Anita actually felt okay walking. You know, she grew up in Blacktown. She was very familiar with the area. She knew the route well, so she obviously thought that she would be fine. So she left the train station and began the walk back home. However, Anita Cobby never made it to her destination. She didn't return home that night. At some point along her route, she just vanished. A couple of hours after this, at around midnight on that Sunday evening, Anita's parents, Gary and Grace, obviously realised that Anita wasn't back yet, which they did think was strange. They did wonder if maybe she decided to stay at a friend's house in Sydney. Maybe she decided to stay with one of her colleagues instead of coming home. But if that was the case, they would have expected to have heard from her. It wasn't like Anita not to keep her parents in the loop with her plans. If she didn't intend to come home, she normally would have called them to let them know. So the fact that she hadn't was strange, but they left it. You know, Anita was a responsible 26-year-old woman, so they just assumed that at some point that night she'd be back, and so they went to bed. However, the next morning, her mother Grace woke up and she peered into Anita's bedroom and she wasn't in there. Her bed hadn't been slept in. She still hadn't returned home, which again seemed odd that she hadn't contacted her mum and dad to let them know where she was. But I don't think they immediately started panicking or anything right away. Like I said, it was a bit strange, but it wasn't like alarm bells were ringing for the Lynch family at this point. I mean, there could have been a number of reasonable explanations as to why Anita didn't come back and why she hadn't been in touch yet, so they didn't think too much of it. It wasn't until later that day when that panic did start to set in, because Anita had another shift at the hospital that afternoon, on the afternoon of the 3rd of February, but she never turned up. And this was so out of character. It was not in Anita's nature to just not turn up for a shift, and also to not call the hospital and let her colleagues know that she wouldn't be coming in. And it was when her parents found out that Anita didn't turn up for her shift that they knew that something was wrong here. This was not normal. Something must have happened to Anita. And so that same day, the Lynches went to the Blacktown police station and they reported their eldest daughter as missing. And it wouldn't be long before this missing persons case turned into a murder inquiry, as just the day following this report, the police received another that a body had been found. On the morning of the 4th of February 1986, a local farmer named John Reen was at his paddock, which was located down Reen Road in the suburb of Prospect in New South Wales, when he decided to investigate this one particular spot in his paddock, in his field, that he'd previously noticed his cows all kind of gathered around. He'd spotted that his cows were all kind of huddled together in this one area of the paddock, which he thought was strange. So he took note of that and was like, right, I'll have a look around that area a bit later to see what all the cows were looking at. So on the morning of the 4th of February, he made his way to that spot, and it was then when he realised that the cows had been gathered around a dead body. There was the dead body of a young woman lying in his field, and so he called the police. So police arrived at the scene and they knew immediately, upon just looking at this poor woman, that what she had gone through must have been truly horrific and sadistic. This was clearly a homicide that they were dealing with, and an incredibly brutal one at that. The victim was naked, completely naked, and there was no sign of her clothing or any other belongings at the scene. She was lying face down on the ground. She was covered, absolutely covered in blood and bruises from where she had very clearly been savagely beaten. She had bruises pretty much all over her body. It was later noted during her autopsy that she had injuries to her legs, thighs and hips, and these injuries looked consistent with like kind of barbed wire. It looked like she'd literally been dragged through a barbed wire fence or something. She had injuries to her breast. She had 2 black eyes. One of her eye sockets was actually broken. Her cheekbones were broken. I think her nose was broken. One of her ears was severed. Her windpipe was severely damaged. The majority of her fingers were fractured, and in fact 3 of her fingers were almost completely severed. The police would go on to theorize that this was from where she'd either tried to grab a knife that was being used by the perpetrator, or from where a knife was maybe held against her throat and she used her hands to try and push the knife away. She was also covered in self-defense injuries, and she had lacerations to her neck as well. And the medical examiner ultimately concluded that this woman had died as a result of her throat being cut. In fact, she was stabbed in the neck so viciously that her head was almost decapitated. That's how deep the wound was. And she'd also been horrifically sexually assaulted too. So it was clear that this crime was sexually motivated. I mean, I feel like there are just no words. The extent that this perpetrator went to cause this poor woman just the most unimaginable pain is truly sickening. And what really stood out to me and just made my heart break when I was researching this case is that the police who arrived at the scene and who looked at her body immediately noticed one thing about this woman. It was the look in her eyes. Her eyes were open when her body was found, and the detectives described how there was just this look of pure agony in her eyes from where she'd just been mercilessly tortured. So upon finding this woman's body, of course, the police's first task was identifying her and letting her family know what had happened. And one police officer did approach the detectives and informed them that just the day before this, on the 3rd of February, he had taken a missing persons report at the Blacktown police station. It was the report that was made by Grace and Gary Lynch, who had reported their 26-year-old daughter Anita Cobby as missing. And so when the officer who took this report heard that the body of a young woman had been found just the following day, he wondered whether it could have been Anita. So he gave the detectives a picture of Anita, and I think instantly upon just looking at it, they were like, yeah, this looks like her. Now, something that was found with this woman's body was a ring. She wasn't wearing any clothing, but she did have a ring on her finger. And so after concluding that the victim was most likely Anita Cobby, the detectives took this ring and they went to the home of Grace and Gary Lynch. They told the Lynches that a body had been found and that they had reason to believe that it was their daughter Anita, and they showed her family the ring that was found on the victim's finger. And her younger sister Catherine said that it did look very much like Anita's wedding ring, even though it was covered in dried blood at the time, which must have just been so upsetting for her family to see. But just to confirm 100% that the victim was Anita Cobby, the police had her father, Gary Lynch, come down to the morgue to formally identify her, which he did. It was Anita, and upon just looking at his daughter's body, Gary Lynch just collapsed. His legs just gave way and the police had to grab a hold of him and help hold him up. He was that distraught, obviously, that he just could not stand. And it was following her identification when news spread. It wasn't long before Anita's husband, John Cobby, received the tragic news, as well as Anita's friends and her colleagues at the hospital. And of course, everyone was just absolutely devastated. And what's really eerie, actually, is that one friend of Anita's in particular, her name was Lynn Bradshaw, and she also worked at the Sydney hospital with Anita. In fact, Lynn was one of the colleagues who Anita went out for dinner with on the evening that she disappeared. And Lynn described in a documentary that I watched about this case that on the night that Anita was killed, she actually had a dream about her. In this dream, she and Anita were chatting and having a conversation, and Anita just said something along the lines of, "Oh, Lynn, I'm not coming into work tomorrow." And when Lynn asked why, Anita simply replied, quote, "Because I'm dying." And this dream really spooked Lynn, understandably. She described waking up in this cold sweat. She was really scared. And she recalled that the time that she woke up from this dream was around 11 p.m. on the night of the 2nd of February. And what she would later learn was that that was around the same time of Anita's death. The medical examiner had placed her time of death as being sometime time around 11 to 11:30 p.m. So the investigation into the murder of Anita Cobby commenced. About 20 detectives were assigned to the case, and whilst they began trying to piece together Anita's last known movements on the night that she was killed, they also started looking into the people in her life as potential suspects, the very first being her husband, John Cobby. He was considered a top suspect right from the very start because he was her partner, and you know, in the majority of homicide cases, the perpetrator is the partner of the victim. And also there's the fact that obviously his and Anita's relationship had previously been on the rocks not too long prior to her murder. So yeah, he was considered a top suspect, but it would appear as though the police kind of had tunnel vision with this. They were just convinced that John was the murderer, despite John denying it and protesting his innocence. And he was innocent, by the way. John did not kill Anita. He was absolutely devastated when he learned the news that she was dead. It completely broke him. But despite this, despite his denials, John claimed that when he was being interviewed by the detectives, they were adamant to him that he was guilty of this crime. John said that the detectives would literally say to him, "You did this, John. We know that you did this. We know that you killed Anita." John Cobby has even claimed that the detectives got physical with him during his interrogation. At one point, he said that he was even held up against the wall and on the floor. These are claims that the detectives themselves have denied, I believe. But they were just relentless with John Cobby, constantly telling him that he was the one responsible for Anita's death, so that he would give a confession. And they wore him down so much that John said he even got to the point where he thought that he thought that they were right. He left that interview room genuinely believing that he was the one who had killed Anita, because that's what the police made him believe. He was so emotional and just out of it, really, from having lost Anita, that he couldn't think straight, and he confessed to a crime that he did not commit. But despite this confession, despite harassing him for it, the police quickly realised that in fact John was not involved. They were wrong. He had nothing to do with Anita's death, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. But John was in such a bad place following Anita's murder that he actually started using drugs. He said that he took heroin literally just a couple of days after his wife's death because he just wanted to die as well. He couldn't cope without her, couldn't cope with knowing what she had gone through in her final moments, knowing that he couldn't save her, and he just didn't want to be alive anymore. He didn't want to be in a world where Anita didn't exist anymore. And every day, every single day, he just wished death upon himself. But back to the investigation. Now that the police had ruled John Cobby out, the hunt was on to find the real person or people responsible for this heinous crime, although this was proving difficult to do. They conducted fingertip searches of the paddock where Anita's body was found and the area around it to see if they could find any evidence which could indicate who the killer might have been, but they didn't really find anything. They hadn't left anything behind, it seemed. And yeah, the police were struggling to identify any potential suspects, and they weren't really getting that many tips or leads from the public, or at least that was until the 6th of February 1986, so 4 days after Anita was murdered, when in a truly shocking turn of events, Anita's full autopsy report was somehow leaked, and it was read out live on morning radio for everyone to hear. John Laws was an Australian radio host who took it upon himself to read Anita's autopsy report on the morning of the 6th of February. He was telling the public about the extent of Anita's horrific injuries on morning radio, which, as you can imagine, sparked a hell of a lot of controversy. A lot of people thought that it was completely out of order for him to do that, whereas others wanted to know the details. And John Laws himself said that he only did it because he thought that the public should know exactly what had happened to Anita. He thought that they had a right to know and that they should feel so incredibly angry about it that they want to help the police in catching the perpetrator. But it must have been awful for Anita's family at the time to have had those details of her brutal death broadcast on live radio just just days after her murder for everyone to hear. It must have been so upsetting for them, although John Laws did say that I think years after Anita's death, her father, Gary Lynch, did actually get in touch with him and thank him for doing that. Thank him for releasing the details to the public, because although it was really distressing for the family at the time, it did ultimately make a huge difference when it came to the investigation, because it did spark this public outrage which resulted in many more tips and leads coming in. In an effort to encourage even more tips, a reward of $50,000 was offered to anyone with information which resulted in the identity of Anita's killer being revealed, and the police also decided to film a reconstruction of Anita's last known movements using a female police officer who looked quite like Anita, and this reconstruction was released to the public in the hopes that it would obviously jog some people's memories. Maybe someone would remember having seen Anita on the night that she died or seeing anything suspicious. And whilst the police were receiving new tips and leads in the days after Anita's body was found, what they eventually realised was that vital information relating to her case had actually been reported to them on the same night as her murder. They just didn't realise it at the time, realise that it was linked. On the evening of the 2nd of February 1986, the night that Anita disappeared, a 16-year-old boy named Stephen Hodgson was just at his home with his mother. I believe they lived on Newton Road in Blacktown, which was a road located along Anita's route that night, the route that she would have taken to get to her parents' house. Stephen said that he and his mother were just sitting watching TV when all of a sudden at around 10 p.m, he and his mum heard the sound of a woman screaming. He just heard these terrified screams coming from outside, and so he immediately jumped up and he ran out of the front door to see what was going on. And what he saw was a car on the side of the road with the headlights turned off, and the woman who was screaming was being forced by these men into the car, and then the car began driving away. And Stephen said that as the car was driving away, as it drove under a street light, he noticed that the men sitting in the back seat were almost knocking their heads on the roof of the car as if they didn't have enough room. It looked as though they were sitting on something. They were sitting on top of the woman that they forced into the car, hence why their heads were bumping on the roof. Stephen immediately tried to chase after the car to help this woman, but of course he wasn't going to catch it on foot. But luckily, just moments after the car drove away, his next door neighbour arrived back home in his vehicle. And so Stephen literally jumped into his neighbour's car. He told him what he had just witnessed. It looked like an abduction. And so he ordered his neighbour to drive after that vehicle that the woman had just been dragged into. And so he did. They began trying to chase it, but unfortunately they quickly lost the car. They couldn't find it. Although sources state that at one point they did drive down Reen Road in Prospect in search for the vehicle, which, if you remember, was where the paddock was that Anita's body was found in. And parked on the side of the road near the paddock was this white-coloured HT Holden Kingswood car, which looked like the car that the attackers were driving. However, now there was no one in it. It looked like it had just been abandoned down Reen Road. Stephen and his neighbour used a flashlight to take a quick look around the paddock area, but they couldn't see anything, and so they eventually went back home, and I think Stephen's mother called the police to report what Stephen had seen. But despite this report of a possible abduction, it doesn't really seem as though the police took much action that night. Apparently, it actually took about 2 hours for an officer to even be dispatched to the Hodgson's address to take a full statement from Stephen. So yeah, not great from the police, but it was days later, obviously, after Anita's body was found, when detectives realised that that report was most likely connected to Anita's case. That was probably Anita that Stephen saw being bundled into that car, which obviously indicated that there was more than one perpetrator here. Stephen saw several men in the car that this woman, Anita, was taken away in. So there was more than one killer. Stephen Hodgson did actually undergo hypnosis to see if he could recall the number plate of the car that Anita was kidnapped in, but unfortunately this didn't work. He couldn't remember it. But luckily they wouldn't need it, as detectives eventually received a tip-off from a police informant about a very similar car which had recently been stolen. It was again a white Holden car, and this informant was able to tell the detectives the names of 3 men that were involved in this car theft. Their names were John Travers, who was 18 years old, Michael Murdoch, also 18, and Les Murphy, who was 22. And upon looking further into these 3 men, the police really began to think, yeah, these could definitely be the perpetrators. These men could have been responsible for Anita's abduction and murder, because a quick dive into their backgrounds revealed that each of them had a lengthy criminal history, which included incredibly violent crimes such as assault and sexual assault, and we'll revisit that a little later on. But now the police had 3 potential suspects. They had no solid evidence at this point definitively connecting these 3 men to Anita's case. However, we know that they stole a car which was exactly like the car that Anita was seen being forced into on the night of her death by several men. So could John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and Les Murphy have been the men? So a couple of weeks after Anita's death, on the 21st of February 1986, all 3 men were arrested for car theft and taken to the police station to be interviewed. And during these interviews, the detectives obviously brought up Anita Cobby and her murder to see what the men would say, how they would react. And it was John Travers' reaction to Anita's murder being mentioned which really stood out to the detectives, which sent shivers down their spines, to be completely honest, because when they started bringing her up, John Travers just very coldly and angrily blurted out, quote, "I didn't slit that slut's throat." Although he was denying it, I think just this comment alone made the police even more certain that Travers and the other men were in fact involved in Anita's death, because if he wasn't, why the hell was he referring to her like that? This is about the horrific torture, rape and murder of an innocent young woman, and he's referring to her as a slut. That told the detectives everything that they needed to know about John Travers, to be honest. It showed them how he viewed women and how angry he got over being accused of this crime. It was clear that he got very angry because he had a guilty conscience. As for Michael Murdoch and Les Murphy, they also denied being involved in this homicide. They said that they were just at home on the night in question, and they were actually released on bail following their interview, whereas John Travers was refused police bail and kept in custody, whilst the police continued with building their case against the men. All 3 men were charged with car theft, although the reason John Travers in particular was refused bail was because at the time of this case taking place, he was actually a wanted man. The police in Western Australia had been searching for him because he had previously raped a young boy at knife point. So yeah, he was kept in custody. He did apparently tried to come up with some kind of escape plan whilst he was kept behind bars. He wanted Les Murphy, I think, to try and help him escape, but of course he was unsuccessful with this. And it was whilst he was in custody that John Travers asked a police officer if they could call his auntie and ask her to bring him some cigarettes to the police station. Now, his auntie actually played a huge role in this case, as you'll come to discover, and her identity has been protected, so she's just known in this case as Miss X, so that's what I'll be referring to her as in this video, either that or Travers' auntie. And the detectives decided to have a meeting of their own with his aunt, with Miss X, I guess to find out whether she thought her nephew could have been involved in what had happened to Anita. And would you believe it, she basically said absolutely, absolutely he could have been involved. Miss X said that she was actually terrified of her nephew because of how violent he was. She'd heard about violent assaults that he had committed and some very, very disturbing behaviour that he had exhibited. She told detectives about his vile attitude towards women, how he spoke about women in a disgusting manner, about how he had an obsession with knives. She didn't know for certain that he was involved in Anita's death, but she strongly believed that he was, and she told the police that. And in fact, Miss X very, very bravely bravely agreed to help the police with their investigation. Obviously, the detectives had already questioned Travers about Anita's murder and he denied it, but clearly he had some trust in his auntie, I suppose, to ask for her to bring him some cigarettes. So the police wondered whether perhaps he would confess to her. So Miss X went to his cell in the police station with his cigarettes and she began speaking to her nephew John Travers whilst there were no officers around. And after this conversation, Miss X returned to the detectives and she just collapsed. She was distraught. She was in such a state. And she told the detectives that he did it. He just confessed to me that alongside Michael Murdoch and Les Murphy, he committed the kidnap, rape and murder of Anita Cobby. But Travers told his aunt that it wasn't just them three that were involved. He said that 2 other men were also responsible and were there that night when Anita was killed. The other 2 men were actually brothers of Les Murphy. I believe Les Murphy was one of 9 children and 2 of his older brothers were also involved in this crime. Gary Murphy, who was 28, and Michael Murphy, who was 33. So there were actually 5 perpetrators, 5, which, oh my God, is just awful to think about. Awful to think about how frightened Anita must have been. You know, she wasn't just being attacked and held captive by one monster that night. There were 5 of them. So she must have known that she had no chance of escape. But before we continue with the investigation, let me just tell you a little bit more about our 5 perpetrators, about these vile excuses for human beings. Starting with the Murphy brothers. So as I said, the Murphy brothers came from a very big family. There were 9 of them, 9 siblings, and Michael Murphy was the oldest, and all 3 brothers, Michael, Gary and Les, had a criminal history. Michael Murphy had spent some time in prison for crimes such as burglary, armed robbery and larceny. And actually, at the time that this case occurred, he was on the run. He'd somehow escaped from prison and was on the run. So just like John Travers, he was a wanted man. Like I said, his younger brothers, Gary and Les, had also had their brushes with the law. They'd committed crimes such as theft, car theft, assaults. They'd had drug-related offences. So they were really following in their older brother's footsteps, clearly. As for 18-year-old Michael Murdoch, again, a lengthy criminal history. He'd been committing crimes literally since he was a child. He'd spent a lot of time in juvenile detention centres and juvenile prison, and according to one report, he claimed that he was actually sexually assaulted during his time in these juvenile prisons. He committed very similar crimes as the other men, so we're talking burglary, car theft, drug-related offences. And interestingly, Michael Murdoch had actually been good friends with John Travers since they were kids. Obviously, they were the same age. They were both 18, and Michael Murdoch was described as almost being like John Travers' little sidekick. He worshipped the ground that John Travers walked on, quite honestly, and I think he would have done anything that John Travers told him to do, which seemed to be the case with the other men as well. The Murphy brothers also very much looked up to John Travers, and he was said to have really been the leader of this group of 5, which I find really interesting considering that he was the youngest, or one of the youngest. You know, he was only 18 and the oldest member of this group was Michael Murphy, who was 33, and yet even he saw John Travers as the group leader, the ringleader. I mean, maybe the other 4 men were even a little bit scared of John Travers themselves because, as I mentioned before, he was an incredibly violent person. John Travers was born in 1987. He was one of 8 children and he was raised in Blacktown, so I think he'd lived there all his life. According to reports, John Travers' home life when he was a kid was not very nice at all. There was a lot of violence in the home. Apparently his father was very physically abusive. Although he didn't stick around for very long, his father left the family in 1981 when John was only about 4. And according to a documentary that I watched about this case, it's alleged that his father sexually sexually assaulted him at one point. Travers was always very badly behaved in school. He was very disruptive, which led to him becoming expelled, and he was in and out of juvenile detention centres as he became involved with crime from a very young age. He also developed a bit of an addiction to alcohol and drugs. In fact, it's said that by 14 years old, he was already an alcoholic. Some of the crimes that he started committing early on included theft. Apparently, he would steal live animals like ducks and chickens to kill for food, because after his father left, it was difficult for his mother to provide for the kids on her own. So John would steal these animals to cook for their meals, but sickeningly, he wouldn't just steal these animals for the purpose of eating them. It's been reported that John Travers would commit bestiality with these animals. Sources state that before killing and cooking the ducks and chickens, he would sexually abuse them. And many people who knew Travers would actually go on to tell the police that on a number of occasions, he stole or he bought a live lamb or sheep, and whilst it was still alive, he would sodomize it and sexually abuse it. And as he would do so, he would slit the sheep's throat with a knife. And then once he was finished and once the sheep was dead, he would roast its body on a barbecue and eat it, which is just revolting. That literally made me feel sick when I read that. But as well as sexually abusing animals, he would sexually assault people too. By 18 years old, John Travers had already committed a number of sexual assaults against both men and women. As I mentioned earlier, by the time Anita was killed, he was already wanted for the rape of a young boy. And this rape was so violent and so brutal that this poor young boy required hospital treatment. He was just an incredibly sadistic individual, was John Travers, and he seemed to take pride in the crimes that he had committed. He was arrogant and proud of the fact that he had this violent streak. I mean, I say streak, but I don't think it was a streak. I think John Travers was just violent through and through. But back to where we were in the case. So like we discussed, John Travers' aunt, Miss X, went to the police station whilst he was in custody. She took him his cigarettes. She had a conversation with him, and after this conversation, she became very upset. She was just in this state of shock, and she told the detectives that her nephew had just admitted to her that he, Michael Murdoch, Michael Murphy, Gary Murphy, and Les Murphy all carried out the abduction and murder of Anita Cobby together. He'd confessed to his aunt, but of course the police needed more than that, because if they went to trial, John Travers' defense team would just claim that his aunt was a liar. It was his word against hers. So they needed to hear his confession from John Travers himself. And so with her consent, the police strapped a secret tape recorder to Miss X and asked her to go and speak to her nephew a second time to try and get him talking about Anita's murder once again, so that this time his confession would be recorded and this could be used as potential evidence. And thankfully it worked. Miss X went back to talk to Travers, and he once again revealed details to her about Anita's murder. And there are actually audio clips of Travers' confession online, so I'll see if I can play them in this video if they aren't copyrighted. But before that, let's talk about the actual events of that fateful night. Now that they had John Travers' confession on tape, the police were able to use that to build a better picture of the true horror that Anita Cobby was subjected to on her last night alive. And it is truly, truly haunting what she went through. So I guess that's just a pre-warning before we get into it. So that evening, the evening of the 2nd of February 1986, whilst Anita was out for dinner with her colleagues, the gang of 5 men were out that night themselves. They were at a pub and they were just drinking alcohol. They all got to the point where they were pretty drunk. And then eventually when the men left the pub, they got into the car, the white Holden that they had previously stolen, and they decided that they wanted to go and buy some drugs. But the issue that they faced was that none of them actually had any money to buy drugs. They didn't even have enough money to put petrol in the stolen car, and the petrol tank was running running low. And so what they decided they were going to do was commit robbery. They decided that they were going to find someone just on the street that they could rob. And at around 10 p.m. that evening, they came across 26-year-old Anita Cobby as she was walking along Newton Road during her journey back to her parents' house. And for some reason, they decided that as well as robbing Anita, they were going to kidnap her too. So two of the members of the gang, I don't know exactly which ones, but two of them jumped out of the car, they ran up to Anita and they grabbed her and began dragging her to the vehicle and they forced her inside. All the while, Anita was obviously kicking and screaming, and as we know, those screams and the abduction was witnessed by 16-year-old Stephen Hodgson, who tried to chase after the car with his neighbour, but unfortunately they lost it. Anita was forced into the back seat where she was literally sat on by three of the men, and they started beating her. She was punched repeatedly, causing injuries all over her body. As we discussed earlier on, her cheekbones were broken, her nose was broken, she suffered 2 black eyes from how savage this attack was. Shortly after kidnapping Anita, the men drove to a petrol station where they filled up the car with gas and paid for it using Anita's money from her handbag. They then left the petrol station and continued to assault Anita in the back seat. She was ordered by the men to remove all of her clothing, and during this, Anita was literally begging them for her life. She was pleading for them to just let her go. She was telling them that she was married, that she had a family. She even told them that she was on her period in the hopes that they wouldn't sexually assault her. But of course, the men didn't care. As I said, they forced her to strip, and every single one of those 5 men then orally raped her. They forced Anita to perform oral sex on each of them. Following this, a terrified Anita was driven to Reen Road in Prospect, which, as we know, is where that paddock was. Once there, she was repeatedly raped in the back seat until eventually she was dragged out of the car still naked and forced into the paddock. She was actually dragged through the barbed wire fence by the men. Now, if you recall from earlier, as Stephen Hodgson and his neighbour were looking for the vehicle that Anita had been taken away in, they did actually go down Reen Road and they saw a Holden car that looked very similar. However, no one was in it. But Stephen and his neighbour took a quick look around anyway. They used a flashlight to look into the paddock and they couldn't see anyone or anything, so they left. However, as it would turn out, the men were hiding in the paddock with Anita when Stephen and his neighbour were there. They had seen the car pull up and they saw the flashlight, so they hid in the long grass and kept their heads down and just waited for Stephen and his neighbour to leave. And I cannot imagine how gut-wrenching it must have been for Anita when they did leave. She must have been thinking when Stephen arrived and when she saw the flashlight that maybe there was a chance that she could be saved. Maybe she would be okay and Stephen and his neighbour would rescue her from the gang. So when they left and that light started to fade and the realisation hit her that there was no rescue, there was no way she was going to get away now, it must have made her feel sick to her stomach, probably knowing how this was going to end. After being dragged into the paddock, the brutal assault of Anita continued. Again, all 5 men continued to take it in turns to rape her. They also continued to beat her, and John Reen, the farmer who later found Anita's body, would tell the police that he did hear screams coming from his paddock that night, the night of the 2nd of February. However, at the time, he assumed that it was teenagers. I think maybe teenagers would often go to that area and hang out, and so yeah, he just thought that it was drunk teenagers having a party or something. But of course, we know that it obviously wasn't. Those screams were coming from Anita as she was being tortured by the 5 men. After inflicting pain and torture on Anita for well over an hour, the men decided between them that they couldn't leave Anita alive. She'd seen their faces, they knew that she'd heard their names, and if they left her alive and she went to the police about the attack, she would be able to identify them. And so they decided that they were going to kill her, to silence her. And John Travers said in his confession to his aunt, to Miss X, that he was the one who did it, who carried out the murder. He said that the other men started saying to him words to the effect of, "Go on, Johnny, do your bit, do your thing." His thing being to slit throats. They obviously knew that he would do this with sheep, he would cut their throats, and so they encouraged John Travers to do the same to Anita. And so John Travers grabbed his knife, I think the same knife that he would use to kill sheep. He would actually tell his auntie in his confession that this was his best knife, his favourite one. He went behind Anita as she was lying face down on the ground. He sat on her, pulled her head back, and proceeded to stab her in the neck and cut her throat. And as we know, this wound was so deep that Anita was nearly decapitated. He then returned to the car where the other 4 men were waiting, and then they drove away, leaving Anita's battered and bloodied body in the paddock.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you. Yes. Take on, it's alright, come here. Take on, I got your smokes. I couldn't see it. It wasn't on the bench. Was it? I don't know how to put it. Did you have sex with her? Did you have sex with her? Did you? Did anybody else? All of them. John, Carlos, why? Why did you have to stop up? Why did you have to do that? Come here, come close. We're all drunk. Should I concede all this? Well, you saw your faces. And you knew. So what the others said you had to do it. What's this just got to be done? Who said it had to be done? You. You all agreed. But that's not your thing, John. You haven't done that before, have you? Truthfully.
After killing Anita and driving away, the gang then drove to John Travers' house where they burned Anita's clothing in his garden. And then they abandoned the stolen Holden car in a bushland area nearby. Apparently they even set the car on fire to, I suppose, destroy any DNA or blood evidence inside. And then that was it. They just carried on with their lives as normal, as if they hadn't just brutally killed an innocent young woman. They obviously thought that that would be the end of it. They'd gotten rid of the evidence and so would get away with the crime. But thankfully they were wrong, and that wouldn't be the case. After speaking to her nephew John Travers and getting the taped confession out of him, Miss X also agreed to go and speak to one of the other men involved in this crime, Michael Murdoch, whilst again wearing the recording device to see if she could get a confession out of him too. She went to his address and told him that Travers had told her everything about what the gang did to Anita. And I believe Michael Murdoch also made some admission of guilt to Miss X too. So now the police felt that they had enough evidence against the gang to arrest all of them for Anita's murder. Obviously they already had John Travers in custody, so now they moved in to arrest the other 4. They were able to locate and arrest Michael Murdoch and Les Murphy pretty quickly. However, the other 2 Murphy brothers, Gary and Michael Murphy, were proving difficult to find. They were clearly hiding from the police, knowing that it was only a matter of time before they would be arrested. So whilst a manhunt for Gary and Michael Murphy was underway, other detectives continued to grill and question the 3 men that they had captured. And actually it was following their arrest for murder when Michael Murdoch and Les Murphy confessed to the police. They admitted that they were involved in what had happened to Anita, but claimed that John Travers was the one who physically carried out the murder. Following their arrest and confessions, Travers, Murdoch and Les Murphy were all actually taken to the crime scene, to the paddock where Anita was killed and her body was found, so that they could basically retrace their steps with the police and give them more details about the murder. And when they returned to the police station in the police car, because, would you believe it, there were crowds upon crowds of people all gathered outside. News of Anita's brutal murder had obviously spread like wildfire at this point. Of course, everyone knew every last detail of what happened to her because John Laws read out her autopsy on the radio, and like I said earlier, this sparked a huge public outrage. Understandably, people were disgusted that they had these evil men living amongst them, and they made that very clear. As soon as Travers, Murdoch and Les Murphy arrived back at the police station, the hundreds of people who gathered outside were shouting and screaming at them, banging on the cars. They made signs and banners which read things like jail them for the rest of their natural lives, and also kill the animals or they'll do it again. The public wanted these men dead. They really did. They wanted them tortured and killed in the same way that they tortured and killed Anita. They wanted the death penalty for these monsters. Interestingly though, the death penalty was only actually abolished in all jurisdictions in Australia just the year before this case took place in 1985. So obviously they weren't going to be sentenced to death for what they had done, but people wanted them to be. Finally, on the 26th of February 1986, the police tracked down Michael and Gary Murphy following a tip-off from members of the public, and they were found hiding in a house in the city of Glenfield in Sydney. The police raided the house and Michael Murphy was captured immediately. He was actually holding a baby when the police busted through the door. I don't know whose baby it was, whether it was his, but the baby was obviously taken off of him and he was arrested. Gary Murphy, on the other hand, tried to make a run for it. He tried to run out of the back of the house, but police captured him. They threw him face down on the ground and he was arrested. And he actually wet himself when he was arrested out of pure fear. This 28-year-old man just wet himself. All 5 men were charged with the abduction, rape and murder of Anita Cobby. Now, when it came to their court proceedings months later, all 5 men actually pleaded not guilty to the charges. Despite the fact that a couple of them had already confessed, they chose to plead not guilty. Apart from John Travers, I think he did initially plead not guilty, however he ultimately changed his plea to guilty just before the trial, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The other 4 men, Michael Murdoch and the 3 Murphy brothers, went to trial in March of 1987, so just over a year after Anita was killed. John Travers' aunt, Miss X, was brought forward as a witness during the trial. She was actually placed in witness protection as she had been receiving death threats for testifying against the men. So I mean, it was incredibly brave of her to still be willing to give evidence. And the men's behaviour during the trial was just appalling. They honestly acted as if they couldn't have given a crap, to be honest. None of them ever showed any ounce of remorse or guilt. They would laugh and smirk in the dock. It was vile, just vile. But thankfully, they wouldn't be having the last laugh, because at the end of the trial in June of 1987, each of them were found guilty by the jury, and they were all sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with the judge, Justice Alan Maxwell, stating that Anita's murder was, quote, one of the most horrifying physical and sexual assaults. This was a calculated killing done in cold blood. The executive should grant the same degree of mercy they bestowed on their victim. To this day, more than 38 years after the crime, all of the killers are still behind bars, apart from the oldest member of the gang, Michael Murphy, who is now dead. He died about 5 years ago now, in February of 2019, at the age of 66. Apparently he died of liver cancer. Anita's parents, Grace and Gary Lynch, have very sadly since passed away too. Gary died in September of 2008 at the age of 90 after suffering from Alzheimer's, and Grace Lynch died 5 years later in 2013 at the age of 88 as the result of lung cancer. But it's important to mention the incredible work that the Lynches did in the aftermath of their daughter's murder. They co-founded an incredible charity in New South Wales called the Homicide Victim Support Group, which we've actually spoken about before on this channel, because Grace and Gary Lynch set up up the group alongside the parents of Ebony Simpson. She was a 9-year-old girl from Bargo in New South Wales, and she was kidnapped and horrifically murdered in August of 1992, so less than 6 years after Anita Cobby's death. And I have actually covered Ebony's case on my channel. I made a video about her murder a couple of years ago now. Following Ebony's murder, her parents, Christine and Peter Simpson, were introduced to Gary and Grace Lynch, and together the two families decided to set up the Homicide Victim Support Group, which offers help and counselling to the friends and family members of murder victims in New South Wales, which is an incredible lasting legacy for both Ebony and Anita. I will leave a link to the Homicide Victim Support Group website in the description box for anyone who would like to check them out and learn more about them, and I'll also leave a link to their donation page if you would like to make a contribution and help fund the amazing work that they do to help people. To also give you an update on Anita's husband, John Cobby, because I know earlier when we talked about him, we kind of left off on the fact that he was struggling so much in the aftermath of his wife's murder to the point where he wanted to die, and he was taking drugs like heroin in the hopes that he would overdose. In 2016, so 30 years after the crime, John Cobby took part in a documentary which was made about Anita's case. It was just called Anita, and I did watch that documentary as part of my research for this video. But yeah, John Cobby took part in that documentary. I think it was the first time he'd actually spoken publicly or done an interview about his wife's murder. John did go on to marry another woman, although they would later separate, and he had 2 children. He had a son and a daughter, and by the time he'd had kids, he'd actually changed his name. He changed his last name Cobby just the year after Anita was killed in 1987. I would imagine partly because it was just too painful for him to still have that last name that they shared, but also because, as we know, Anita's case was all over the media. Everyone in Australia, everyone in the world really, knew about her heinous murder. Everyone knew the name Cobby, and John was already finding it so incredibly hard to deal with his wife's death anyway, let alone the fact that people knew who he was, knew that he was her husband. He would get journalists knocking on his door trying to ask him questions about the case. It was horrendous for him. He couldn't move on. So I think he just didn't want to be associated with the name Cobby anymore. It was too agonizing for him. And so yeah, in 1987, he changed his last name and he became John Francis. And when he had kids years later, they grew up never knowing who their father really was, never knowing about his past, about how he had lost his first wife in such a devastating way. That was until one day when John was sitting with his son Daniel. They were watching TV together when all of a sudden another documentary about the murder of Anita Cobby started playing on the TV, and John just completely broke down. He just started sobbing, and of course his son was confused as to why. And that was when John decided to finally open up to his kids and tell them that Anita, that woman that the documentary was about, was his wife who was murdered years and years ago. And in 2016, so nearly 30 years after he changed his name, John decided to actually change it back. He went with his son Daniel to the Department of Births, Deaths and Marriages, and he changed his name back to John Cobby, and his son Daniel also became Daniel Cobby. John finally felt in a strong enough place to have his original name back, and I have a quote here from his son Daniel. He wrote a post on Facebook just before they changed their names, and it read, "Most of you know me as Dan Francis. I wanted to let you know that tomorrow my father and I are changing our surnames back to Cobby, our original family name. Nothing can change what happened to Anita almost 30 years ago, but tomorrow we are taking a big step in the right direction to having a life with a touch of relief. This is a huge step individually and as a family. I couldn't be prouder of my dad and what he's achieved. Tough times don't last, but tough people do." And that is it for this case. That concludes the case of Anita Cobby. Genuinely one of the most tragic and sickening cases I've ever come across. The members of my Patreon will know that this case has been on my list to cover for a while now, and I've always put off starting my research research into it because I knew that I would find it so difficult to delve into, because it's just horrifying when you think about the sheer terror that Anita experienced that night, again at the hands of not just one but 5 monsters. It's insane really that there were 5 of them and not one of those men thought at any point that evening when they were beating Anita and raping her, violating her, not one of them thought we shouldn't be doing this. This is so wrong. To them, abusing Anita was just a night of fun and entertainment. They stole her life and her entire future for their own sick sexual pleasure. And I'm so glad that the 4 of them who are still alive are rotting away in prison to this day. But yeah, that is it for this video. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them in the comments below, or alternatively you can go through the case request form that is linked in the description box. Thank you so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.